take item number 2 first, since we have representatives that will address this. So item number 2 is the resolution number 116/1876, the application for the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA funding, and making related application to the State Bond Commission. Mr. Guidry?
Yes, thank you. Back at it during its November 4th meeting, the board approved both the project listing and preliminary action with regards to related bond sales. Since that time, we were contacted by USDA, Rural Development, and made aware of a funding program whereby the high school project in the Youngsville area qualifies for that type of funding. The interest rate, there are two immediate benefits that become obvious when you start taking a look at the details. The first is the interest rate, which without actually trying to sell the bonds, we can't give you an exact interest rate if we were to sell general obligation bonds, or limited tax bonds, but we would estimate it to be about 1% lower. Last quarter, it was 3.25%, and it may even be lower than that. I believe it might be at 3.16 or thereabouts. So there's a benefit of a lesser interest rate, and there's also the benefit that the amortization period is 40 years as opposed to 30. So that spreading of the debt service allows us to take a look at basically additional projects. So what we're presenting to the Finance Committee is a request to approve staff, first of all, to approve the resolution that would amend the previous resolution that was sent to the State Bond Commission. The amendment would allow us to basically pursue this USDA funding. And then we're also asking that we be allowed to go through the application process to obtain the USDA funding. At this point, I'd ask if there are any questions. We do have two representatives from USDA, Mr. Richard Hoffpauer, who is the Community Programs Director at the state level, as well as Mr. Ricky Hewlin, who is the Construction Analyst for the Rural Development Program. Ask if you have any questions if you don't mind standing up, ask if you have any questions, USDA representatives or myself with regards to this particular agenda item.
So I have a question that out of the $126 million of bonds that were authorized, we are going to sell, this resolution would sell $80 million of that to the USDA?
We have $80 million in the resolution just to allow some room, just depending on what the project ends up getting bid, what the construction cost ends up being in the final stages. We're in the final stages right now of coming up with that number. We're anticipating that it's going to be closer to 70, but we put 80 in there just to allow us some room. So we are asking that the resolution be approved. The resolution says 80, but there's a better chance of the amount that we're going to request being closer to 70.
And is that limited to the high school?
At this point in time, yes. We do have another project that would qualify, but that would be a separate application. When we move forward with Catherine Drexel, that particular project would qualify for this type of funding as well.
All right, so for you gentlemen, I have a question. What qualifies under the Rural Development Program?
Under the Community Facilities Program, which is the subsidiary program of the USDA Rural Development, any population area or project within 20,000 or less population or an unincorporated area, thus the Youngsville area falls under the definition of what is an eligible area. We can work with public bodies, such as school boards, municipalities. We can work with nonprofit organizations and tribal communities. So the purpose is eligible. It's an education project, something we love doing. We've done quite a few, both public schools, charter schools. We've worked with a lot. It's in an area that's booming. I mean, there's no doubt. I'm a South Louisiana product, still live in South Louisiana. The Youngsville-Broussard area has picked up and grown tremendously. It's just a project that fits our program quite well. Again, interest rate dropped to 3.125. If we could lock in an obligated project between now and April 1st, the interest rate for a 40-year fixed rate term would be no worse than 3.125. It changes every quarter. Come April, if it goes up to 3 1/8, from 3 1/8 to 3 1/2. Your worst case scenario is still 3.5. You're looking at whatever we obligated it at. That's your worst case scenario. 2 years when we sell the actual bonds and we purchase the bonds during the construction period. That's typically 2 years. The worst case scenario is known. You know what it's going to be. It's simple interest. You can pay it off early. No prepayment penalties. We move pretty much at the speed the school board's going to move. The architect's going to move. The feasibility people are going to move. We have funding available. We haven't seen the feasibility study yet. But based on what I've seen from bond counsel and the financial folks, it looks good. I can't give you a commitment today, but I think it's very favorable. It's a heck of a program. We do a lot of projects every year. This will be one of our larger projects that we worked with. I hope it's one of several. The 40-year term gives you a little more borrowing capacity. Not only can you do the school project, but you've got another project or two down the road I'm hearing about. They may give you the borrowing capacity to do more than one project.
Is it a sliding scale of interest where we pay more interest on a 30-year term or a 20-year term? I'm sorry. Is my microphone on?
I couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. Is it a sliding scale on the interest? Is it
It's
where?
fixed.
No, I mean if we did a 30, or maybe you don't even offer 30-year bonds.
Whether you did a 20-year, 30-year, or 40-year, it's the same interest rate. The good thing about the 40-year rate, if you have a low tax period or something, you have that luxury of having that lower payment. If you have a good period, pay extra. It's a wonderful program. And no prepayment penalty.
Mr. Guidry, do we typically have an early payment penalty on bonds that we sell in the marketplace?
Some of them cannot be refinanced for a certain time period. They become callable at a certain point in time. Besides that, Matt, are you aware of any other stipulations with regards to?
Even some of the reserve requirements on our part are going to be a little bit easier than you're going to see on a commercial market.
Yeah, basically in a refinancing, you'd have to, refunding, you would have the call usually halfway through. You can't call those. Those are permanent. And the ones that you would call after the interest rate environment would have to be enough to make it make sense. And you'd also have to go through the issuance costs of refunding, which is expensive and sometimes overwhelms the savings. So in this situation, we could just, if we wanted to, pay it off, assuming that interest rates would go down. But with interest rates almost at zero, I can't imagine in the future, 20, 30 years from now, I would say we'd be getting more than 3.12 in our checking account like we used to 5 years ago. We'd be making money on this.
You have a higher opinion of the business of checking accounts than I do.
We used to get close to 5% when I first got here. I mean, it was significant. But when interest rates were 7 and 8, right now they're zero, so we get basically zero. But 40 years, I only see that going one way, and it can't go down much further. So with this kind of interest rate, we may end up making money in the long term when we get towards the later of the payment schedule. We may actually be making more money on our money than we would be paying in interest for the money we borrowed to build the school.
As a banker, don't underestimate the chances of us making you pay for a checking account in the future, okay? Mr. Broussard, do you have any questions?
I'm not in the financial market. I'm not a bank. I'm not a financier like the rest of them. It's the rule. You you work with primarily the rural area. My question to Mr. Guidry, and perhaps to you, is Catlin Drexel falls in that category as well. So my question is, I know the 70 million is targeted for one project, another 20 plus million for another one. Is it financially feasible to do that would be 90 plus a million? Why the 80 instead of both projects?
Well, Catherine Drexel isn't far along enough to include in the application process. From a timing standpoint, we'd need to at least have a site, the land purchased, or so the timing of it is such that we're not including them in the same application. The 80 million, as I mentioned, is we're going to come back to the board and give a specific amount when we actually file the application. It's just to allow for that to occur, so that the board can make a decision. If the cost estimates for the high school come in a little bit higher, it gives the board that latitude to make that decision. If the board chooses to stick to the original amount, we can do that as well. But to answer your question, if we keep it at 70 or thereabouts, then the amount for Catherine Drexel would still be intact, and we could just file a separate application once we're further along in that process, at least having identified or purchased the property. But the timing didn't allow us to put both of them together.
It's our intention, our hope that you do come back to us for the second project. Is again, we have to have the site to be able to do our environmental assessments and do our due diligence. But again, we've had discussions about it. We've discussed with bond counsel and the financial folks to see if it was financially viable. Again, if we come in with the 70 million, give or take a little, things look favorable.
When does the application to the bond commission need to be submitted?
We're waiting on you.
No, that's not what I asked. I asked when does it have to be submitted, not when can it be submitted. I'm sorry.
Again, the program runs year round. There's not it's not like a notice.
Well, I guess it's not really you guys that I was asking about, because we do have to
For
apply
bond
to
commission?
the state bond commission first. So I guess it was for Mr. Guidry or Mr. Dugas.
Yeah,
Are we under a deadline, especially when? And then I have a second part of the question: is how far along or how close are we to getting our estimate from the construction manager at risk?
We're expecting that estimate within the week, and with regards to the bond commission, we're presenting this to the board tomorrow night with the hopes that the board would give us indication, would vote on it or take action at that point in time. The time frame is more when the funds will be needed. So the sooner we do it, it basically opens the door for us to begin the project, so to speak, without fronting the money ourselves. So the time frame or restriction is more our cash flow needs, and trying to limit the amount that we have to put up front, more so than a deadline that if we miss, we're gonna be out of luck. So with that said, we're trying to get the board to take action on it tomorrow evening, so that we could have the funding in place in time for when the project is substantially underway. When we get beyond the dirt work, when the construction actually begins, we'd like to have the financing vehicle established.
So to I guess summarize this, an approval of this resolution submits an application to the bond commission, and then there would be a second, I guess it would be a resolution for the full board to vote on the actual amount that we agree to as far as the construction manager at risk estimate. Is that correct?
There's going to be
Like we're not going to sell 80, right?
Correct.
We're going to sell whatever the if we don't agree to the CMAR price, then we're going to sell the bonds to meet the bid price of the project. Like whatever we agree on to the price of the project, right? That's how much
Right, and this is a little different than bonds, which is something we have to mention. This is a construction in progress. So normally we issue bonds, we go out, we get the money, all of it, we put it in the bank and we spend it. This is the opposite. We incur the expense,
Construction loan?
we send it in and they send us that money, and we don't start paying interest till we get the money. So it's going to save us a lot of interest in the construction time to be able to run up and not have to get all the money up front and then hold it for a couple of years while we're building it. It literally will follow the construction. So that's going to help us in addition save quite a bit of money.
But we will come back with a resolution that will be required when we actually enter into the debt arrangement,
Okay.
the interim financing. That will require a resolution that will have the specific amounts.
So just for my own education, yeah. For my own education, how do you guys, like, what do you do with our debt? This is strictly for my own education right here.
Again, we're actually the purchasers of the paper,
Right.
of the actual, the bonds.
Do you hold it?
We hold the bonds. You'll actually issue bond anticipation notes where your local lenders can be involved in the construction, if they can handle a $7 million transaction. It's a good way to participate it out as well. And then we'll actually be the holder of the bonds upon completion of the project. You know, and the one thing good about the bond anticipation note phase, if things are favorable, we're going to actually provide a takeout letter, basically to that interim financing lender that says if X, Y, and Z happen, X, Y, and Z mainly being that the school is built, then we will take out that loan with our actual permanent bond financing.
Okay. All right. Any other questions, Mr. Brousseau? Does anybody in the audience have a question? No? All right. Well, I'll move to recommend that the board approve this resolution at our January 6th meeting. Anyone opposed? All right. I'll let the secretaries catch up with us in a second, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming tonight. And then moving on to item number 1, the revised eligibility rubric for receipt of 2002 sales tax 14th check and 13th check from the 2001 sales tax fund. I think this will be a pretty short one because I certainly paid attention to the executive committee discussion of this item, and it seemed that they went over the material in depth. There was.
Did y'all want to take a vote on this motion?
We voted by voice.
Y'all voted?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. There was a note that was pointed out where their recommendation may not have been fully encompassing, such that, and is Suzanne still here? Okay, so it seemed like if I'll get this oversight correct, it seemed like they did not fully clarify when they said, and the pupil appraisal staff. Is that right? Like there was a fear that they may have over-included for positions in the future?
Yes.
Okay, and so the I guess recommendation should be the pupil appraisal staff as defined in Bulletin 1706, which
That
is
would be correct.
educational diagnosticians, school
That would be
psychologists, and
correct.
social workers.
That would be correct.
Okay.
As a part of the pupil appraisal team, there is an additional job that you voted on, and that's the 504 dyslexic diagnostician. But you specifically approved that job description last July 1, and that person is also on that list, but is not technically a member of the pupil appraisal team based upon Bulletin 1706.
Okay, so the recommendation needs to be that, see now, I had it all in my head, and I should have written it down. So the
What we discussed was the educational diagnosticians plus the pupil appraisal staff as defined by
you mean the
bulletin
504
with-
diagnostician?
Well,
Because educational diagnosticians are in this pupil appraisal staff as defined.
Okay, but we have
1706.
educational diagnostician that's not on the pupil appraisal team, so that's why we said we would say an educational diagnosticians because we may add educational diagnosticians, I don't know, but any educational diagnostician, because they're listing in the administrative plan, educational diagnostician plus the pupil appraisal staff is what we discussed.
Plus the 504
or
diagnosis, or is the 504 an educational that does the 504 get captured under
The
educational?
504, right, 504 is an educational diagnostician. You could say that position, if you want to say that position, 504, to make sure she's included. The 504 educational diagnostician plus, but any educational diagnostician would be covered on our district because they're in the plan, plus the pupil appraisal staff. Is it defined in the bulletin? That's what we had said.
Well, I thought you just said there are some educational diagnosticians that are not a part of the pupil appraisal staff.
That's why we said we would put that first and then say also the pupil appraisal staff.
The ones that are not on the pupil appraisal staff should be excluded or included?
Included. Because if you vote on it, just
They're already
what Mr. Kniezek had said, to vote on it as an assessment teacher is defined as someone being on the team, the pupil appraisal team, or well, then you exclude the person you've already voted on because she's not on the team.
Okay.
You see, he wanted to define an assessment teacher as someone in pupil appraisal.
And in fact, it is someone in pupil appraisal or the 504.
So he wanted the people in pupil appraisal and the educational diagnostician. He wanted both those.
Oh.
So he wants
I
both.
I see. Okay. All right.
I'm sorry, Bruce.
No, I see, because there are social workers that are not part of pupil appraisal. That was the sticking point.
And there are
Okay.
also psychologists that are not members of the pupil
Okay.
appraisal team.
Okay. I got it. So the recommendation should be that we define assessment teacher as all educational diagnosticians, as well as pupil appraisal team members as defined in Bulletin 1706. There we go.
That's our understanding.
There we go.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, tomorrow, I will also have copies. I have them here, and I didn't have them in my folder. I have copies of the job descriptions of the 3 members of the pupil appraisal team, so I'll include that. You'll also have a package of the bulletin that describes 1706, who's on the pupil appraisal team, and then you'll also have Bulletin 706, 726.
746?
746, sorry, that describes the qualifications for each group in order to be a member, be an educational diagnostician, social worker, or psychologist. And there are several different subgroups of qualifications for the psychologists in particular. But I'll have excerpts of all that for you if you don't have it already. And I could actually give that to you now.
I'm not asking for individual names, but which job titles are currently not included?
Not,
Some educational diagnosticians, is this what or the social workers in pupil appraisal are not included, right? Is that right?
currently,
Currently.
you're talking about, based
what
on the
what are
board
we
vote.
changing? What are we changing? That's
Yeah.
what I'm asking.
Based on the board vote in May, the social workers and psychologists were excluded from consideration for the
All of them were.
13th check and inclusion for the $1,000 bump on the salary scale. Okay?
And now what we are doing is we are including just those 2 job categories that are a part of pupil appraisal.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's what the motion to the board is for tomorrow night. So on that basis, what I'll have is copies of the qualifications of each of those 3 groups so you clearly understand who is a certified teacher and who is not, vis-a-vis the entire list of who's a certified teacher on that entire list and who's not.
So now what happens when the State Department of Education adds some new job title to Section 13 of Bulletin 1706?
Well, if they add it, then, and we have to write a new job description or modify an existing job description, then we'll have to bring that to the board and say, is this sales tax eligible or not, based on the rubric. I think the most important thing for the board would be, first of all, identify the rubric that you're going to use, and then use that rubric as the standard for measuring any job, not an incumbent, but any job against that rubric. And if that job fits the rubric, then it becomes eligible. And then if you've expanded who is an assessment teacher, then we have to exercise care in clearly delineating, are you a pupil appraisal psychologist or a school psychologist? Because there's two different job descriptions, and they would have different eligibility levels.
So there are two rubrics on the agenda item.
I gave you the existing rubric, and then I've given you the modified rubric. The existing one is the one that you made your decisions on based upon your vote in May 20th.
Okay.
And then this rubric is based upon feedback from the board, where I put some footnotes on the rubric. I also indicated how you would qualify. You have to meet all 4 criteria or item E. And then if people change jobs and go from eligible to ineligible or ineligible to eligible, we'll have to have a form that they sign off indicating that they're changing their job status and that has an impact on them.
So how would what I just described as the recommendation be incorporated into this rubric, the modified? Where is
Or the
so they have A, B, C, or D, right? And they all have to be yes or E. And then I see the footnote on assessment teacher, which
and
is
E
what
is where the
we're discussing.
description that Suzanne just gave you and what
But it says, but footnote 3 says Bulletin 1706 and 746 currently define the ed diagnostician as the replacement certificate for assessment teacher for children with exceptionalities. No other position qualifies, but we were just discussing school psychologists and social workers. So I want to make sure that those are somewhere in this definition of
well, then
assessment
I'll
teacher.
have to, we'll make a material modification to it
That's
tomorrow
what
night.
I'm concerned.
Right.
I want to make sure that the
Yeah.
exact wording gets included in this rubric somewhere. So
And that's where I would, that'd be the best place to include it, because it takes us outside of the administrative plan. Effectively expands the who's covered in the administrative plan as an assessment teacher as part of the pupil appraisal team.
Who was here in 2007 when social
It
workers
wasn't
were
me.
first included? Anyone?
I'm just,
Mr. Thibodeau?
this is, right.
Anyone working in pupil appraisal at that point? Rudy? You were teaching? You were coming to these meetings? All right.
And I'll also provide you with copies. We check with the state.
So my concern, I'll tell you my concern and what I just off my impression of what would be the easiest thing to do is there are going to be 2 job descriptions for social workers now,
Well, it would have to be.
right? Because there's the checkbox that says sales tax eligible.
That's correct.
So why shouldn't we just bring the affected job descriptions to the board and let us vote on it without materially altering the administrative plan? That may not be a question for you. I'm just curious as to, wouldn't that be the easier thing to do, where we're certainly not going to have any unintended consequences by doing this, right?
Yeah.
Because we finally got to the point where every job description we have has the checkbox, and we voted on it,
Right.
and we moved on. So if we're going to include more instead of trying to define general categories,
Mhm.
shouldn't we just say, well, these 3 job titles are modified, and we believe they qualify now?
And I'd say that would be worth your consideration. The one thought that I have on that would be I'd want to get some guidance from council on how we'd have to word a resolution to make those exceptions, if they're exceptions, and be clear on exactly how
Well, it
it's
doesn't sound like
defined.
they're exceptions. It sounds like we missed it the first time. It sounds like we missed these the first time. The delineation between
That may be true.
between the different types of work that social workers and psychologists do.
That would be true.
You have any questions, Mr. Broussard? 'Cause I'm sitting here thinking about this. I don't know if I want to.
I'm just sitting there hoping that we finally get a clear picture of who deserves the check and who. I think we're right back where we started when we started this. Everybody's getting the check again.
You're not gonna get the world. You're not gonna get a clear impression of who's eligible for the check.
I know we're trying to find the best solution, and I know that. Keep going back and forth to try to find the best way to clear this. And thankful that you are, but it's difficult task as it is.
I just making the point that perhaps it would just be easier since we got to the point where everybody was in or out, to use a drastic term, but everybody was in or out. And then if we need to correct something, then let's just bring those specific job titles. Because I think one of the problems is that, as we say in footnote 3, currently defines ed diagnostician as the replacement for assessment teacher, right? So one of the problems is that assessment teacher was used in 2002, and now that evidently doesn't exist anymore. It has a better
And that's where
certainly
we
a different
contacted the
description.
state. We wanted to be sure that, first of all, that had indeed occurred. So we do have an email from the state indicating that the educational diagnostician is the specific replacement for the assessment teacher. And I'll have that email for you tomorrow.
So I'll say my opinion. I think I'm in favor of what you're recommending. I agree with your assertion that these particular job titles should be eligible, but I don't know that I agree that we should go and change this rubric here. I think I'm in favor of voting individually so as not to open any potential cans of worms, or certainly not have to revisit this 4 years from now when the State Department of Education decides to call it something else.
And, I will let either Joe or Dr. Aguilar comment, but we spent quite a bit of time deliberating on what would be a rigorous rubric that would allow us to have an objective standard that then focused on a job, not a particular person or a particular group of people or a particular job in general. But our goal here is, if you look at that rubric, it's to compensate those people that are directly and regularly engaged in a classroom
Please
with
understand, this is no
students.
criticism of
Yeah.
the work of the rubric. I think
Right.
the rubric is great. I
Right.
think I agree with what you're saying. I agree that they should be eligible. I'm just trying not to leave anything for future boards to say, well, what did they mean by this word? And what did they mean by this footnote to this bulletin that no longer exists, or this footnote to this bulletin that no longer says what it said in 2016? So
That's right.
that-
I agree with you.
that's my point.
I agree with you 100%.
And I appreciate all of the work that you guys have done, because I think this is a very strong rubric, and I think it describes pretty clearly what we went through in May. So I am happy to forward the recommendation of the executive committee to the full board. But I'll certainly bring this up tomorrow night so that the other board members may consider this alternative. So I will move that we send the recommendation of the executive committee to the full board. Second. All right. Being none opposed, it carries, and if no one has anything else, we will adjourn. Thank you.